Hello there. Hi there, and welcome to the webinar. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. Also, we appreciate your patience. We know there was some confusion between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock start time, so we're glad you're here. And rest assured that this will be archived, so if your peers and colleagues were not able to jump on the webinar at this time, they can watch it just a little bit later on our website. Before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. If you'll hang on one second. This webinar is produced by the CATA Project, a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources. Funding for this project comes from the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. For those of you who can hear me, this is probably going to seem obvious, but I just want to remind you to turn on your speakers in order to hear the presentation. Please note that there are two features to ask questions. The Q&A feature to ask the presenter any questions that you might have regarding the content. We will begin with questions that have been emailed in prior to the live session. If your question isn't answered right away, please wait until the end of the presentation. The chat panel is where you can ask technical support questions. We will answer those questions immediately in the chat panel. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today. Amita Swadhin is an educator, storyteller, and consultant dedicated to fighting interpersonal and institutional violence against young people. Their approach to this work stems from their experiences as a genderqueer femme woman of color, daughter of immigrants from India, and years of childhood abuse by their parents, including 8 years of rape by their father. In 2016, Amita received a Just Beginnings Collaborative Fellowship, allowing them to launch the Mirror Memoirs, an oral history project centering the stories, healing, and leadership of LGBTQI people of color who survived child sexual abuse. In January of 2017, they testified on behalf of survivors of sexual violence and LGBTQ Americans in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee against Jeff Sessions' nomination as the U.S. Attorney General. They are a frequent speaker at colleges, conferences, and community organizations nationwide with over 15 years of experience working with low-income immigrant and LGBTQ communities of color. I will now take the time to turn the controls over to Amita, if you will just give us a few seconds to do so. Perfect.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes, sounds great. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for making time to join this webinar today, and thanks for that introduction. For those of you who weren't in our prep session, we went over the pronunciation of my last name, but not my first name. So my first name is pronounced Amita, and it's really an honor to be here with all of you today. I see some familiar names in the list of attendees, including people who have transcribed for Mirror Memoirs and people who have actually shared their story with Mirror Memoirs. So please do jump in with comments and contributions as well. So as you heard, I'm the founder and director of Mirror Memoirs, which is an oral history and leadership development, as I like to call it these days, a storytelling and organizing project. And this really comes out of years of my own work in the field of ending sexual violence and more broadly social justice work in mostly grassroots communities, but also at levels as high as the Office of Violence Against Women, which is where I actually started my career when I was in college as an intern at the U.S. Department of Justice. And so what I'll do today is sort of take you through the model, and I do have notes from those of you who sent in questions ahead of time, so I'll try to integrate my answers to your questions along the way. And then, as you heard, we will have a couple minutes at the end to answer any questions that come up. I first want to talk about our language in this work to end sexual violence, and particularly around my work, which often gets categorized as work to end child sexual abuse. And when I first entered this work in 1997, I was about 2 years out of my own survivorship experience. As you heard in the introduction, I grew up in a pretty textbook home of family violence. I grew up in northern New Jersey, about 20 minutes outside of New York City, in a small town in Bergen County. And my parents are immigrants from India. I'm their oldest child. And my mom married my father after knowing him for only 3 months. She actually, I think a lot of Americans often assume incorrectly that they had some kind of arranged marriage, but my mom actually came to the United States at the age of 11 and went to middle school here and high school here and converted to born-again Baptist Christianity when she was in high school. And so a lot of the theology and ideology that really shaped her thinking around things like family and having a husband and the authority that she believed a husband had over her came to her not really through our culture. My grandmother was a socialist freedom fighter who, as a teenager, was resisting the Portuguese and the British in India, and who was a PhD student in the United States. So my mom was really, I guess, in many ways rebelling against my grandmother and her path, and really fell into quite a conservative group through the church when she was in high school. And so I share all of that just to help you understand how I come into this work and how I understand what I see as silos in our work. So my mom and dad had only known each other 3 months before my mom decided to marry him. She dropped out of college because he forced her to. She was 18 when they got married. He was 26. And he was really looking for a way to stay in the United States because his visa was going to expire. And so immediately they became embroiled in a really textbook case of domestic violence. My mom was completely dependent on him economically. She married him against my grandmother's wishes, and really felt like she couldn't admit when physical violence began between them, that she had perhaps made a mistake. And I was planned. She was 19 and a half when she had me. And then we lived on our own for a couple of years. But when my father rejoined us, my parents had a clothing store at the time selling clothing from India. And so when I was quite young, before the age of 4, my parents lived separately, and my dad did the wholesale for the business in New York City, and my mom and I had the shop. Well, my mom had the shop. Obviously, I was a toddler, but my mom had the shop when we were living in Maryland. And then when I was 4, she had my younger sister and was no longer able to run the shop by herself. And we rejoined my father in New York City. And it was right after my sister was born that my father's sexual violence toward me began. And so it did occur on a regular basis in my home, but it's really important for people to understand that it really occurred in a context of an already ongoing abusive domestic violence relationship between my parents. And so there was state involvement in my case when I was 13, because I disclosed the abuse to my mom in an attempt to protect my sister. The rape in my life stopped when I was 12. So it went on quite regularly, at least a couple times a week from the age of 4 until I was 12. And then when I was 12, it stopped. And when I was around 13, I started to realize, well, if it's not happening to me anymore, is it happening to my younger sister? And my sister is 4 years younger than me, and I was quite protective of her as a child. And so that's what led me to disclose to my mother. And when I disclosed, my mom called a therapist in order to get me help. And immediately, of course, mandated reporting was triggered, and neither of us had known what that was. We didn't know to think about it. And so before I really had the language to describe to my mom or anyone else the full extent of what I had lived through, there were strangers in our home. And this would have been 1991 in northern New Jersey. So before there was a wave of cultural competency, before the Violence Against Women Act, and the social workers all happened to be white. The prosecutors involved in the case were white. The police officers in the case were white. And they really were not equipped either on a cultural level or on an age level, really, to engage with a fairly precocious child of immigrants who was racialized, at a young age, meaning myself. And so the social worker said to me, well, we know this happens more in your culture, so you can trust us, which I landed on me as racism, right? Because it just didn't strike me as true. I had already heard from a number of my peers that they too were survivors. And so, not that I had disclosed to them, but a lot of young people had told me about their own experiences. So I knew that it wasn't necessarily more common in South Asian immigrant communities. And then the prosecutors threatened to prosecute my mom for being complicit in the violence in my home and to, send my sister and I to foster care. And obviously that wasn't something that I wanted either. And so it was a really difficult engagement with the state. It felt very non-consensual to me. It wasn't something that I wanted. I definitely wanted more time to think about what healing would look like for my family. I definitely did not want my father in my house. I didn't really want my father to be part of our lives anymore. But police involvement and having the prosecutor say things to me like, well, if you move forward in this case, you're going to be put on the witness stand and the defense team is going to call you a liar. Are you ready for that? Rather than giving me resources to think through, how do you put into words what has just happened to you? And how do you prepare yourself to share your story? So again, I know that this was 20 years ago. I know that there's been a lot of good progress around, things like child advocacy centers, for example. But I still think we have a lot farther to go to really serve all survivors. And so I did want to share my personal story there because it so informs the work that I do. I was able to get a Victims of Crime Compensation Award from the state of New Jersey, and that was very helpful for me, mainly because I was able to go to group therapy. And it was talking to other survivors my senior year of high school, who were other teenage girls who were incest survivors who had state involvement in their lives, that really changed my life. Being able to hear from young people who had the same experience as myself, being able to see different coping mechanisms. For me, my main coping mechanism was workaholism. I really leaned into schoolwork and perfectionism and getting affirmation. I happened to be really academically oriented at a young age and really into extracurricular activities. And so school became an escape for me. But for the other girls, they had very different coping mechanisms than myself. They were engaging in things like cutting or narcotics use, promiscuous sexual activity. And then the youngest one, who was 13 and also South Asian, actually ended up being committed to the county mental health hospital within the year that we were working together in therapy. And she ended up taking her own life there. So that experience was very formative to me in many ways, just being in therapy with those girls and seeing the different ways that survivors cope, because I understood myself as part of something bigger and really started to look at my own reaction to trauma without having the language for it, but understanding that, I don't really understand how yet, but this has made a big impact on my life. And then I went to college and I went to school at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and found the Violence Against Women office, which had just been created. I went to school in 1995, and of course, VAWA passed in 1994. And so had the good fortune to intern with Bonnie Campbell, who was the first presidential appointee at the Office of Violence Against Women at the Justice Department in 1997. And so that brings me to the slide that is up right now, because when I got into the work in 1997, there were 3 different buckets of so-called victims, or what I like to say as survivors, right? There were people living through intimate partner violence. There were adults living through sexual assault, and sometimes teenagers were being talked about in this sexual assault category in terms of peer-to-peer date rape. And then there was a whole other category of child welfare work. And mostly what was thought about as people falling under child welfare were people going through physical abuse or mental abuse. And so for me, coming into this work 20 years ago, anti-violence work, I didn't see a way, an organization, a platform, a policy strategy to actually address the reality of families like my own, where it was a case of intimate partner violence. There was also sexual assault from my father toward my mother. Of course, I was also being sexually assaulted. And then, as a child, there was child welfare issues, child abuse involved in my day-to-day life, right? Besides the child sexual abuse, also emotional and physical violence. So I like to use the term intimate violence rather than these silos, because I think it can be an umbrella term that really talks about the reality that most of us who are harmed sexually or physically or emotionally are harmed by people that we know, and often people that we live with or are in a close familial relationship with. So I'm going to pause there for a minute, just breathe with me. It's kind of funny to not be able to see all of you, but it's an important introduction into how I approach this work and why I got into the work to create new models. So this sort of lays out that terminology that I just talked about, intimate violence versus intimate partner violence, which is how it's traditionally been talked about. I really prefer the top, the umbrella term. I want to talk as well about who has traditionally been centered in anti-violence work and how that has been very limiting for myself and other survivors in my communities. So traditionally, places like the Office of Violence Against Women and the many, many rape crisis centers and domestic violence shelters that are supported by such funding tend to center mothers, cisgender women, which means people who are not transgender, heterosexual women, white women, able-bodied women, women who are citizens or green card holders, and adult women. And especially, I think, when policies are created to support survivors, we often have, the policymakers often have the woman who is all of these things on this slide in mind. And obviously that is certainly part of who survivors are, but it's not the full picture. And I think it leads to some huge problems when we actually base public policy, right? Massive laws, either statewide or even nationally, on just a few people's stories. So cases in which a single survivor's story has been used to create a new national level law include the story of Megan Kenka, who I'm sure many of you know her story. She was a young white girl who was raped and then killed by someone in her immediate neighborhood who actually was a sex offender who had been prosecuted in the past. And this was before there was a sex offender registry. And after Megan's murder, her mother really believed at the time that having a list of who are the known sex offenders in her neighborhood would have empowered her to better protect her daughter and perhaps save her daughter's life. And then another more recent case is the case of Amanda Wynn, who in 2016 was able to get the Obama administration to pass the Sexual Assault Survivors' Rights Act, which really emphasizes the testing of rape kits and the end of the rape kit backlog, which, if you don't know, simply refers to the fact that in police stations throughout the country, there is a backlog right now of DNA tests that have been collected for people who come in and say that they've been sexually assaulted or raped. And the kits themselves have not yet been tested, which leads to a backlog in prosecution and oftentimes leads to victims not being able to move forward in prosecution when the rape kit is not tested within the window of time that aligns with the statute of limitations. So, you know, it leads to a question for me about which survivors get to be the ones whose stories inform sweeping public policy, and who decides which issues are the biggest legislative priorities. Because when I think about the work that I'm doing with LGBTQ people of color who survived childhood rape specifically, I actually don't see these laws as being either pertinent or laws that create a lot of healing or laws that even really apply to our community. And let me explain why. But what really drives me to think about this is, of course, the quote by Chimamanda Adichie that you see on the screen. She warned us in her TED Talk a few years ago about the danger of the single story. And the single story is not, the problem with the single story is not that it's untrue, not that the stereotypes that it's based on is untrue, but that they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And I think that this is what's happened in the field of ending sexual violence when we look at someone like Megan Kenka or someone like Amanda Wynn, and we see what's happened, that their story somehow is supposed to represent all survivors. So I want to talk about which victims then become erased when people like Megan and Amanda get lifted up. I'll talk first about my colleague Nicole Pittman, who leads an organization that she founded in Oakland called the Center on Youth Registration Reform. So Nicole is African American. She is a lawyer by training, and she traveled the United States collecting 500 stories from people, adults, who were placed on sex offender registries nationwide when they were children. And she found two things in 100% of the stories. Number one, the people who had been placed on the sex offender registries when they were children faced a lifelong arc of criminalization, creating a revolving door of things like homelessness, addiction, unemployment, and even being incarcerated in the juvenile system and later in the adult system at a much higher rate than the general population. And number two, in 100% of these 500 cases, Nicole found that children who were placed on sex offender registries had actually been victims in the child welfare system before they ever so-called offended or reacted sexually against another young person. And so I think this is a really important case of how narratives, stories can be used to really push back against current legislation, or to highlight the ways that our current system is actually creating more harm, and perhaps even the very kind of harm that we hope to end. I think it's really worth noting that Megan Kenka's mother has become a big supporter of Nicole's work, that she has seen what the sex offender registry has become, and that it was the way it's being implemented in many states is not at all her intention of what she had hoped to create in the wake of Megan's death. And something to know specifically about California is that we have one of the most disproportionate rates of Black children, and particularly Black boys, being placed on the sex offender registry. I believe it's from Nicole's research, about 70% of our juvenile sex offender registry is Black boys. So, obviously what we've created through Megan's Law is a policy or a system. We've reinforced a system that disproportionately criminalizes certain populations, and specifically Black people, because of the history of this country. And so that always gives me pause when we think about what do we do, what do we create when we use one survivor's story to legislate an entire system. A couple other survivors who I want to tell you about, all three of these people are in Mirror Memoirs as participants sharing their story. There are 60 people in Mirror Memoirs, by the way, across 15 different states, and they are all LGBTQ people of color who were raped as children. So the first is Kai Peterson. He is the co-founder of an organization called Freedom Overground, which does advocacy for the rights of transgender people who are currently incarcerated and support services for transgender people returning home after being incarcerated. And Kai's story in brief is that he's African American, grew up in rural Georgia, rural South Georgia specifically, which is an area in which the main economy is supported by two industries, farming and prisons. And Kai grew up in a trailer park. He experienced sexual assault and specifically repeated childhood rape from his grandmother's boyfriend when he was about 6 or 7. And when he disclosed that abuse to his grandmother, she believed him, and she confronted her boyfriend, who ended up killing her in front of Kai. And when the police arrived to question both the boyfriend and Kai about what had happened, the boyfriend said that it had been a suicide. And Kai told the truth, which is that his grandmother had been killed by his perpetrator, and the police believed the perpetrator. And so I think Kai got a very early lesson that a lot of African American children get in this country, which is that the police might not protect you. They might not believe you. And so that was Kai's first engagement with the criminal legal system in Georgia. And then as time went on, he ended up socially transitioning, which means, when he was born, the doctors said that he was a girl. And pretty early in life, in his adolescent years, he ended up telling his mother that he felt like he was a boy and ended up dressing like a boy. And his mother accepted him. She was a single mother who had 2 other children, 2 boys, and really welcomed the idea of a young man around the house to help with bills and help with childcare. And so that really wasn't an issue. Kai's transgender identity was not an issue in his family. However, he did face a lot of street harassment and a lot of community harassment. And he learned pretty early on, after being physically attacked more than once, to carry a gun for self-defense. And Georgia, by the way, is a stand your ground state, which means that if you shoot and kill someone in self-defense, you should be able to use that as your defense in a court of law. Well, Kai was out with his brothers one day when he was 20, and his brothers were 14 and 16. They went to an arcade, and Kai sat outside to sketch in a sketchbook. And when his brothers were inside playing video games and he was outside with his sketchbook, a Latino migrant farm worker, male, walked past him and was sexually harassing him. He read him as a young gay man and was propositioning him for sex. And Kai happens to be straight. And Kai said to him, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. And this man wouldn't relent. And so Kai got frustrated, and he went in and told his brothers, I'm going to go home. I'm just being harassed and I want to leave. And so the brothers said, okay, we'll be close behind you. We're just going to finish playing our video game. So Kai went back to the trailer park, not knowing that the man who had harassed him was also staying there and knew exactly where Kai lived. And this man hit Kai on the head from behind with a blunt object so hard that Kai ended up passing out. And when he came to, he was being raped and sodomized by this man. And there was a struggle. His brothers who were following closely behind and were at that point looking for him, heard the noise. They were able to pry open that trailer door where the attack was happening and pull the man off of Kai. And Kai, as soon as the man was off of him, reached into his bag, grabbed his gun, and shot and killed his rapist in self-defense. A rape kit was actually collected in the forensic evidence process, but both the forensic nurse and the public defender who was assigned to Kai said, well, we see that the rape kit corroborates your story, that you were raped and sodomized, but you don't look like a rape victim, so we actually are not going to enter that into your defense. And I'm just going to pause there because those words really stay with me, right? You don't look like a rape victim. Kai ended up being sentenced to 20 years, and he is currently serving time in a women's prison in Georgia State. There have been several attempts to get his sentence commuted unsuccessfully, and he is up for parole again in 2021. So you can Google his name. There is online campaigns to support him and bring attention to his case. But, Mirror Memoirs was really founded because time and again, survivors like Kai are falling through the cracks. Two quick other stories, they won't be as long, but other Mirror Memoirs participants are the women listed below here. Janetta Johnson, who is the executive director of the Transgender, Gender Variant, and Intersex Justice Project, which is a national organization based in the Bay Area. And Bambi Salcedo, who is the CEO of the Trans Latina Coalition, which is a national organization based in Los Angeles. Janetta is an African-American transgender woman, and Bambi is a Mexican-American transgender woman. Both of them were raped as children by more than one perpetrator. And both of them also survived incarceration as adults, where they were also raped. They've also been, both of them, victimized in street violence. They've faced violence from the police, especially when engaged in survival sex work, and have faced a lot of employment discrimination and even homelessness, which led them to survival sex work. And so when I think about Kai and Janetta and Bambi, I think about whose story is missing from the policies that we have created thus far around ending sexual violence. And someone had a question earlier, when you registered for the webinar, about what does it mean in this current moment where Me Too is being celebrated in the media and a lot of celebrities are talking about sexual violence. How do I think about that with my own work? I think we haven't yet really heard a national conversation on transgender people and the level of violence that they live through from childhood all the way through adulthood. We haven't heard a conversation around the current system that we've created to support survivors actually failing most transgender survivors of color. and the way that the systems that we've created, from foster care to the prosecution process, actually creating more harm in a lot of transgender people of color's lives. Even mental health hospitals have been a source that a lot of Mirror Memoirs participants have said are sites of harm for them. A lot of transgender children of color, when they are put into mental health hospitals, experience rape and sexual assault again, because often they've already experienced that violence at home or in their intimate community. So I want us to think about, what would it look like to have Kai's Law? Or what would it look like to have Janetta's Law or Bambi's Law? How would we approach the healing services for survivors differently? What would we set up that could actually support these survivors? I also want to name what stands out for me in this media moment that we're in that doesn't quite capture these people's stories is, I think we're imagining as a nation right now that rape and sexual assault is an issue of unidirectional harm. What I mean by that is the current conversation in the media almost exclusively focuses on the harm that cisgender men commit towards cisgender women and girls. But there was actually a study done by the Harvard School of Public Health that was published in the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2012 that shows that when we talk about gender and children and sexual violence, it's actually gender nonconforming children who are most at risk. They are up to 6 times likelier to be raped or sexually assaulted than gender normative children. And the most at risk are actually gender nonconforming boys, right? People who were assigned male at birth, like when the doctor was born, the doctor said, oh, that's a baby boy. But then as that child grows up, that child exhibits signs of nonconformity. Either they talk in a way or walk in a way or play with toys in a way or like to dress in a way that the adults around them see them as gender nonconforming. Those are the children that are most targeted in terms of rape and sexual assault, up to 6 times likelier. And so what we see in a project like Mirror Memoirs is time and again, survivors disclosing the ways that they were punished through sexual violence and other forms of abuse for their gender nonconformity, and that it usually is many more than one perpetrator, and that arc of violence continues into their adulthood. The other thing that we see in these Mirror Memoir stories that is much more complicated than the current national conversation around sexual harm is that perpetrators come in all genders. So we see, yes, some cisgender men being the ones who are raping and sexually assaulting children, but we also see a lot of cisgender women. And that is not talked about at all on the national level right now, which, to me becomes more and more curious when I think about it, because you may have heard that in the new documentary about Whitney Houston, what comes out is the fact that she was sexually assaulted for years, along with her brother, by their older female cousin. And of course, if you think about high school psychology textbooks and what we know about what used to be called multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder, that diagnosis is based on the case of a little girl named Sybil, who was raped repeatedly by her mother. And that's nothing new, right? That story is not new at all. It was taught in my high school textbooks. There's a movie that was made about it in the 80s, I believe. And so somehow in this national Me Too moment, we've lost the conversation around the complexity of sexual violence and who really is a survivor, which is a very gender diverse group of people, again, with male assigned at birth children who are gender nonconforming being the most vulnerable, and then who can be a perpetrator, absolutely including cisgender women. I want to talk about why this is so problematic to me, the complete erasure of transgender people and especially transgender women in the work to end sexual violence. We know that in terms of all women, transgender and non-transgender, 86% of people incarcerated in women's prisons report having experienced sexual violence in their lifetimes prior to incarceration. There's actually an African-American cisgender woman named Taylor Nuevelle who is formerly incarcerated, and she founded a project called Who Speaks for Me, to support people coming out of that experience, people who were child sexual abuse survivors, who then got incarcerated and now have to live with that double trauma. And she calls this phenomenon the trauma to prison pipeline. We also know, of course, that rape and sexual assault happen in prison, especially by staff. That's why we have legislation like the prison rape, PREA, the prison reform. I cannot remember the acronym off the top of my head, but it is a law nationally to address the issue of rape in prisons. But of course, a law is not enough to completely change the culture of prisons. We know that from a study as recently as 2016, women make up the majority of victims of staff on inmate sexual victimization. And I bring that up to just name, when we say that we want to end all forms of rape and sexual assault, to me, it means we have to also address the systems that we've created and really think about, are they serving us? If our goal is to end all forms of sexual violence, might we have to rethink what we do with the people who have perpetrated harm? If the current solution of locking them in a cage temporarily, if they even get prosecuted effectively, is really going to help them. Is it a site of healing? Is it a site of transformation? Or is it a place that we put people temporarily where they either engage in more harm or get more harmed themselves? I want to also talk about the disproportionate level of violence and the lifelong arc of violence that transgender people often experience in terms of sexual violence. We know that 1 in 2 transgender individuals are sexually abused or assaulted at some point in their lives. 72% of these people specifically have experienced child sexual abuse. We also know that 15% of transgender individuals have reported being sexually assaulted while in police custody or jail. And that's more than doubled to 32% when you're talking about, when you're talking about, when you're talking about African American or Black transgender people. And we also know that in terms of being in police custody, the police are unfortunately too often a site of sexual violence themselves, right? And I know that we have law enforcement folks on this call, and I really welcome your allyship, because I don't think we can change this without people on the inside. It's a serious problem that we hear time and again in the Mirror Memoirs archive. When it's disseminated next year, people are going to hear many instances of transgender people who were raped as children, then growing up into adulthood and being pushed into different kinds of survival economies, and then experiencing more sexual assault from police officers. And so what I think we need, one of the things that we need to really support all survivors is really extensive and comprehensive training for police departments throughout the country on the reality of criminalization and struggle that many transgender people, particularly transgender women of color and Black transgender men, go through in order to survive, and how we can transform police departments to be a source of support, a source of knowledge about how to support the transgender community, and making sure that no transgender person is ever raped by a police officer again. There's just really no way around that. We have really good data, both narratively and through studies like the ones quoted here, that that's actually a huge source of sexual harm in the trans community today. In terms of children, I've talked already about the study that Mirror Memoirs was actually based on, the fact that gender nonconforming children are up to 6 times likelier to be sexually abused. Of course, I use an intersectional approach, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But what that really means is looking at all of the ways that difference makes particular children more vulnerable than their peers, right? So in addition to being gender nonconforming, if you are living with a disability, and particularly an intellectual disability, you can be up to 4 times likelier to be sexually abused. This is not on this slide, but I recently learned from a colleague of mine who is deaf and a survivor of child sexual abuse, and who does work in the deaf community with survivors, that 1 in 2 deaf children will be raped or sexually assaulted by the age of 18, which is just shockingly high. We also know that being LGBTQ, in addition to being gender nonconforming, like following under the LGBTQ umbrella, makes you really vulnerable to violence in a myriad forms. So in major cities throughout the United States, 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. 68% of these homeless youth indicated that family rejection was a major reason why they're homeless. And 54% of these homeless youth indicated that abuse in their family was something that they were running away from. And so I think when we talk about child sexual abuse, we need to start connecting the dots, right? We need to start looking at, okay, gender nonconformity made you vulnerable in your household. You were being bullied in school. You were being shamed for the way that you were gender nonconforming or queer or transgender. And then perhaps you were also being raped within your home or abused in other ways as well. And then you got to a point where you were either kicked out of your house or you were running away from home to leave that violence. And so how do we connect those dots so that every LGBT serving organization in the United States and every anti-violence organization in the United States better understands this intersection of vulnerability? And then we know, of course, in this current political climate, your immigration status also makes you quite vulnerable. We see this in the news in this particular moment with unaccompanied children and the link to being sex trafficked. But we know that undocumented children who are living with their parents are less likely to report any violence that they might be experiencing from their parents because of fear of deportation. In terms of institutionalized youth, youth who are in mental health hospitals or in juvenile detention, we know that they're also incredibly vulnerable to experiencing sexual violence in those institutions. And again, I want to talk about the complexity of gender in perpetration. There was a study done by the US Bureau of Justice Statistics that found that 90% of children who were in juvenile detention who reported being victimized were actually boys reporting being sexually assaulted by female staff. And so it's really important to me in Mirror Memoirs to help expand the conversation of who is a survivor, who is a perpetrator. And when we talk about children, it's really across all genders in terms of both survivorhood and perpetration. You may be familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, but for me, I discuss this in my work a lot to help people understand why it's so important that we get this work right. Because we're talking essentially about a public health epidemic with really long-term impacts. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study was started in 1997, and it's an ongoing longitudinal study with over 17,000 Kaiser Permanente patients in it. It's actually a pretty privileged group in terms of race and economic class. It was mostly white and mostly cisgender, and that's because, and mostly middle class. And that's because in 1997, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente paired together and used Kaiser Permanente patients as the study pool. And at the time, you had to be employed to get Kaiser Permanente insurance. So why I bring that up is because even in a fairly privileged group, what you see on this index, you got a point for every question that you answer yes. And so your ACE score could be anywhere between 0 and 10. What you see in this index is that the question around child sexual abuse, even in this more privileged group, was 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys, which is roughly 20% of the American population, right? Let alone all of the other complicating factors of adverse childhood experiences and trauma. We also know that there are huge long-term public health impacts or implications of this study. So people with scores of 4 or higher, and I have a score of 7, so I include myself in this, are at greater risk of everything from improper brain development and developing things like PTSD because of it, to even physical diseases like heart disease, lung disease, liver disease, obesity, cancer, suicidal ideation, the propensity to be in abusive relationships, and of course self-harm through things like addiction. So I can't really think of any other public health issue that affects this many people that we just don't have the language and the framework to talk about at the level of complexity that can really hold the way the violence actually happens. And that's partly also what motivated me to start Mirror Memoirs. And quickly to talk about intersectionality and intimate violence. Intersectionality is the chart that you see here on the screen, right? Where it really tells us if we want to solve social ills and work towards social justice, we should be working at the center of people who are experiencing ableism, xenophobia, classism, ageism, racism, homophobia, sexism, transphobia, and Islamophobia at the same time, right? That quote unquote fictional human being who lives at the center of all of those forms of violence is a real person. And if we design programs that are suited to serve them, then we actually design programs in which no one gets left behind. And so I like to add to that, when I think about Mirror Memoirs and what we're attempting to do as a team, it's also adding, did you have the experience of being raped? Because I think in this world, to make it all the way through your lifetime without experiencing sexual violence is actually a privilege, especially because of what we know about trauma and the neurobiology of trauma and how it changes your life trajectory to go through trauma. It can cause mental health impacts, and to the point where you have a disability. I myself have complex PTSD. It's something I need to manage on a daily basis. Intimate physical violence, especially repeated violence in your home, is a similar phenomenon. So when I think about Mirror Memoirs and how we're trying to do our work, it's at that intersection where that red circle is, right? Making sure that we don't leave any survivor behind. And so this talks a little bit about how difficult it is to center children's rights in the United States, and just wanting to remember the context that we're working in, right? The first case of prosecuting child abuse in the United States happened in 1874 in New York City, and it was a foster care child who had been severely abused by her adoptive mother. She had to be represented in court by an animal rights attorney because there were no children's rights attorneys at the time. So I say that to anchor us around, like, it is important to understand what we're up against, but I also think it's important to realize how far we've come, right? We've come a long way since 1874. And I think about child sexual abuse like any other social problem that used to have no infrastructure around it, right? Like LGBT rights or reproductive justice, and fighting for the right to an abortion, or HIV and AIDS. All of these issues used to have no infrastructure, no funding, no social movement, no public awareness. And because of the leadership of people who had a close friend or a loved one die from an illegal abortion, or die from AIDS, or live through hate crimes, or even die from them, or be persecuted for their identity of being LGBTQ. It was people who were brave enough to come forward with their own story or the story of a close loved one that really created that infrastructure. And so I like to anchor us in that, like, number one, how far we've come, and number two, there have been other movements built by directly affected people in the past. And I think we can, achieve the same for child sexual abuse, and so many of us being survivors. So how do we do this? For me, the answer has very much been about survivor storytelling and survivor leadership. So the first time I did that work was from 2009 to 2012. I created a project in collaboration with an off-Broadway company in New York City called Ping Chong and Company. And there were 5 of us in the original cast. We sort of wove our stories together, 5 of us who had been raped or sexually assaulted as children, very diverse group around gender and race. And we wove our stories together chronologically and performed it several times in New York, including filming it. I wrote a curriculum guide to go with the film. And today the project has actually been replicated in more than 7 communities. I just found out this morning that we just had a production with a different cast in Michigan, in the Arab American community there. And it's gone international. There was a production in Mexico City last year. So really exciting work. You can check it out on secretsurvivors.org, where you can actually get the DVD and the curriculum guide. And so what that project did was start to create a way nationally for people to talk about child sexual abuse, not as one person's heroic story, but as a public health issue, as a way of seeing that our stories are connected. And what was left out in Secret Survivors was, of course, the particular vulnerability of people at the intersections of oppression, and specifically transgender and gender nonconforming people of color. And so I received a fellowship in 2016 to create a leadership development, like storytelling and organizing project specifically for this community. And so we've actually collected 60 stories. I should update this slide, but 60 stories across 15 different states. We have transcribed them all. We're starting to code the data now, and thinking about what dissemination will look like. And so, do we do a podcast? Do we do an art exhibit, animated videos, toolkits, create webinars like this one, actual training institutes like folks like yourself can come to and learn the model and learn the policy implications as well. So I would love to hear, as a follow-up, what would be useful to your organizations as we are able to see the bigger picture of the lessons that we're learning here, because you're really our intended audience. We want to see organizations like the ones you're working in, be they government or community-based organizations, like really start to change your approach to supporting survivors based on what we're learning. And we actually had our first national convening last year. There were 31 LGBTQ people of color who were raped or sexually assaulted as children, gathered for 2 days, doing healing work together, but also starting to envision what would a different approach to work to support survivors look like, such that none of us get harmed by the structures being set up, right? And such that all of our needs are being met and we can actually start to find healing and community. I just want to say really quickly about narrative. I think a lot about brain science and why I think storytelling has to be the backbone around survivor-led advocacy is we know that storytelling, when it's done well, when it's a storyteller telling someone they know will be empathetic, someone who is part of their community in some way, or someone who really sees them, it actually releases dopamine and activates mirror neurons in your brain, which you can read more about this, but it's a way to actually help your brain heal after trauma. And I've certainly experienced that time and again through Secret Survivors and Mirror Memoirs. We're also seeing that in our evaluation from the 60 people who have been through the process, that it's been not a replacement for therapy. I've benefited from a lot of therapy myself, but it's in addition to, and I believe it unlocks a different kind of healing that therapy alone cannot offer. I just want to talk also very quickly, I know we're running out of time, but some of you had asked, like, what can nonprofits do? And for me, part of the answer is destigmatizing survivorship, right? So many people who do work to help survivors are actually survivors ourselves, but we have been forced to work in nonprofits in which there's a false binary between who's a client and who's a staff member. And that actually hinders the process of this slide, right? Like, it hinders the ability for survivors who you're trying to help actually seeing you as a peer and as someone who is perhaps further along in your healing process. So I think something that nonprofits can do is destigmatize the process of coming out and let people know who are on staff, like, you get to be your whole self. You get to lead with your survivorship along with your professional credentials. I actually think that makes our movement a lot stronger. I think when we do that, when we create organizations, advocacy and government organizations where we can be our whole selves and own our survivorship, we decrease our blind spots, right? We have our own stories making up the quilt of survivorship and informing the collective approach of how we build this movement. And so this is a picture from Mirror Memoirs from the conference we had last year. This was at the end of 2 days of really intensive work together. And the thing that stands out to me about this picture the most is that everybody's smiling, right? We've just been through 2 really intense days of talking about our own stories, talking about the epidemic of childhood rape, talking about the way it disproportionately affects our community. And yet people are feeling joy in their togetherness. People are feeling joy in breaking isolation and seeing each other and feeling part of something bigger, feeling understood, feeling loved, and in community. And that, to me, is what healing is about. It's also what building a movement is about, because all of these people are now getting trained to do talks like this one and to collect more stories for the Mirror Memoirs archive. So I'm really excited about that. Additional projects by my colleagues who are also funded in the same fellowship as myself, who are also people of color who were raped or sexually assaulted as children, are up on the screen now. And we have just a few minutes left that I do want to open up to questions and just thank you for your time.
So it looks like there's one question in the Q&A panel, and it's about the ACEs. It says, is the ACE score 1 point for every factor a person has checked off? Yes,
You can read more about that ACE score online, but yes, the researchers from the CDC and Kaiser Permanente created a 10-point scale. You get 1 point for every one of the 10 questions that you answer yes.
Perfect, thank you. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to send them in the Q&A section of the webinar. We'll just kind of give people a couple seconds to see if they have more. A reminder that this webinar will be available and archived on our website shortly, so you're free to access it later or share it with your colleagues and go back and review the information. But if there are no other questions, we can wrap it up now. So I want to thank you, Amita, very much for your informative webinar of information. It was really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really quick on that question that just popped up. Yes, there are people in the Mirror Memoirs archive who have specifically survived commercial sex trafficking. There's at least 3 stories off the top of my head that fall into that category. Thanks for asking.
Perfect. A great question. We're free to hang out and see if other questions come in. I don't want to take anyone's time if there's silence, but we can also wrap up if nothing else comes in. Oh, it looks like someone put a question in the chat section. It says, for nonprofits who have leadership that is primarily white cis men, how can you present and fight for survivor-centered programs and leadership for trans and queer people of color?
Great question. I think diversifying your staff is really important, and in a shorter term solution, making sure that you have you're going to trainings and conferences that are led by queer and trans people of color. So Mirror Memoirs hopes to create a training institute like that, but there's others like the Allied Media Conference, or making sure you're attending webinars by organizations like the Transgender Law Center or the Trans Latina Coalition to make sure that you're doing that professional development. Great question.
Perfect. Thank you. I don't see any other questions, so we will go ahead and wrap it up. I want to thank everyone who attended, and of course to our presenter for being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.